Thursday, 7th of June, 2018. The early hours of the morning in a quiet nature reserve outside Kirrimuir, Angus, Scotland. Two wardens beginning their day walked towards the car park at Loss of Kinnedy. It was cold, still, the kind of silence that hangs heavy before sunrise. But what they came across would shatter that calm forever. A white BMW stood burned out, its shell twisted by heat. Underneath lay something so damaged by the flames it was almost beyond recognition. What followed was one of Scotland's most shocking murder investigations, a case that would expose jealousy, betrayal, and a calculated plan that began with a meeting arranged by someone he trusted most. This is the story of Stephen Donaldson and how a life full of promise was pulled into darkness. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Stephen Donaldson was, by all accounts, a young man with his life ahead of him. Born and raised in Arbroath, Angus, Stephen was 27 years old at the time of his death in 2018. Friends and family remember him as fun-loving, loyal, and hardworking. Someone who was both easy to be around and deeply dependable. He wasn't the type to make enemies. In fact, those closest to him often said it was hard to find a single person who would say a bad word against him. Stephen worked in the oil industry, a demanding career that kept him busy but also gave him financial stability and opportunities for the future. Colleagues described him as professional and focused, while his friends outside of work saw the lighter, more adventurous side of his personality. When we talk about his passions, well, he loves riding motorbikes. He was well known within the local biking community, often attending races, runs, and social events tied to the sport. For Stephen, motorcycles weren't just a hobby. They were a central part of his identity and a way of connecting with others who shared the same love. Beyond his career and interests, Stephen was also a devoted family man. He was close to his parents, Bill and Pam Donaldson, who later described him as a great son and a friend to everybody. He had a wide social circle and was the kind of person others trusted, reliable and loyal. His friends would later speak about how deeply they missed his presence, saying he was like a brother to them. But like many young adults, Stephen's life wasn't without complications. He had been in a relationship with a local woman, Tasmin. The two had dated on and off, and though their relationship eventually ended, ties between them weren't completely cut. Tasmin was still part of his life, and Stephen, being caring and perhaps too trusting, remained in contact with her. At one point, he even became the father of her unborn child. He was, in many ways, an ordinary young man from a small Scottish town with dreams, responsibilities, and the promise of a long future. Tragically, he would never see that future. To those who first met her, Tasmin did not fit the image of someone who would one day be at the center of a brutal murder case. Born and raised in the small town of Kirrimuir, she was remembered during her teenage years as bright, talented, and ambitious. She attended Webster's High School, where she excelled in subjects like art, music, drama, and dance. Beyond academics, she had a natural stage presence. She had sung in a local band as well as taken part in amateur dramatics and earned praise for her strong singing voice and performances. Friends described her as confident and charismatic, with a striking presence that drew people in. On the surface, she looked like someone destined for opportunity, not notoriety. But beneath this image, Tasmin carried personal troubles and a complicated personal life. By her late teens, she had entered a relationship with Stephen Donaldson. Their relationship was never straightforward. There were good moments, but also plenty of rows. But the people around her also shaped what came next. Two names in particular would come to dominate this story: Stephen Dickey and Callum Davidson. Dickey, in his early 20s, was already well known in Kirrimuir. Unlike Stephen Donaldson, who was steady and reliable, Dickey carried a reputation for trouble. He had been described as aggressive, volatile, and quick to temper. He projected loyalty to those close to him, but it was mixed with a violent streak that made him dangerous. Alongside him was Callum Davidson, also 24 at the time. Davidson had a history of dishonesty and a reputation for violence. In court, his own defense counsel would later concede that he could be gratuitously violent. Friends and associates often described him as unpredictable, capable of turning to aggression with little provocation. These two men were already marked by patterns of violent behavior. Their presence in Tasmin's life introduced a far more destructive influence. Exactly how their paths became entwined and the role each played in the events that followed will be explored in a few minutes. As the relationship between Stephen Donaldson and Tasmin Glass broke apart, a new and dangerous dynamic began to form. Tasmin soon entered into a sexual relationship with Stephen Dickey. Dickey, just 24 at the time, was fiercely jealous and became possessive over Tasmin. The triangle between Stephen, Tasmin and Dickey was not simply about romance. It became a dangerous cocktail of jealousy, pride and resentment. Stephen still maintained contact with Tasmin, often calling and texting her even after their breakup. On the night before his death, multiple phone calls were exchanged between them. Tasmin later admitted she worried about how Dickey would react if he found out that Stephen was still reaching out to her. She described him as protective and jealous, confessing that he would have gone mental if he had seen Stephen's number on her phone. But beyond jealousy, there were practical pressures weighing heavily. Stephen had spent thousands of pounds supporting Tasmin, including buying her a car that she later crashed. When the insurance money came through, she was meant to pay Stephen back. Though she gave him most of it, she still owed £1,000. For Stephen, it was a debt to be cleared. For Tasmin, it felt like a problem she didn't want to deal with. Friends later said she seemed worried about how Stephen would react if it wasn't paid. To Dickey, Stephen was an obstacle, someone standing in the way of his hold over Tasmin. Getting rid of him meant securing his own place in her life. Davidson, on the other hand, was loyal to Dickey and was willing to lend his strength. What began as a failing relationship spiraled into something darker. A young woman under pressure, a jealous new lover, and a fiercely loyal friend formed an alliance. This toxic mix of jealousy, debt, and pride formed the triangle that would set the stage for everything that followed. Wednesday, the 6th of June, 2018. The day began like any other in the small Angus town of Kirrimuir, but before it ended, plans were already in motion that would lead to Stephen Donaldson's death. By then, tensions between Stephen and Tasmin Glass had been simmering for months. He wanted the final £1,000 she still owed him. That evening, Tasmin contacted Stephen to arrange a meeting. She suggested they meet at the Peter Pan Play Park on Kirry Hill, a quiet spot overlooking the town. But simultaneously, she was in contact with Stephen Dickey and Callum Davidson separately to end this dispute all for once. Evidence showed she ferried Davidson to collect a baseball bat, dropped the two men off near the park, and messaged Stephen to make sure he'd come. At first, Stephen hesitated, but her messages made it clear, "You either meet me up the hill or not at all." What Stephen didn't know was that the meeting was never meant to be just between the two of them. Behind the scenes, Dickey and Davidson were already preparing. Along with the baseball, they also equipped with heavy-bladed weapons which never recovered, but later believed to have been a machete, cleaver, or axe. Davidson would later tell others that Stephen was going to be given a hiding. To Stephen, it looked like an ordinary reconciliation, a late-night meeting with his ex-partner, a chance to clear the air and perhaps resolve their dispute. To Tasmin, Dickey, and Davidson, it was something else entirely. The setup was simple but effective. Stephen arrived in his white BMW, trusting Tasmin enough to meet her unarmed and alone. Instead, he was heading straight into an ambush. It was just after 11 p.m. when Stephen Donaldson reached the Peter Pan Play Park on Kirry Hill. The ambush began almost immediately. Davidson struck first, attacking him through the car with a baseball bat. The blows left him dazed and injured, unable to defend himself. Tasmin, who had been the reason Stephen was there at all, left the park, abandoning her own blue car nearby. This vehicle would later be found at the murder scene, tying her directly to events. Stephen, meanwhile, was left in the hands of the two men. Barely able to resist, Stephen was forced to remain in his own car as Dickie and Davidson took control. They drove him from the play park to the Kennedy Loch Nature Reserve, a quiet, isolated spot on the edge of Kirriemuir. There, the violence escalated. Stephen was dragged from the car and attacked with brutal force. The baseball bat was used again, each strike causing devastating injuries. A heavy bladed weapon was brought into the assault at this time. The injuries Stephen suffered were catastrophic. His spinal cord was severed in 2 separate places. He had 26 separate wounds, including cuts, chops, and stabs. Many were defensive injuries, evidence that, even in those final moments, he tried to fight back. Once Stephen was fatally injured, his attackers attempted to erase the evidence. His body was dragged beneath his BMW, and the vehicle was set alight. By the time flames consumed the car, Stephen's life had been taken in an assault that investigators would later describe as one of the most savage they had ever seen. What had begun as a simple late-night meeting had ended in shocking brutality. And by morning, Stephen Donaldson's name would be known not only to his friends and family, but to the whole of Scotland. The following morning, Thursday 7th of June, 2018, what we talked about, 2 RSPB wardens in the intro of the video, they saw the wreckage of a vehicle. A white BMW stood burned out. The alarm was raised immediately and they called the police. Within hours, Police Scotland had sealed off the reserve and surrounding roads. Forensic teams worked carefully through the scene while detectives began piecing together what had happened. It quickly became clear this was no accident. What they were looking at was a murder. Detective Superintendent James Smith described the case in stark terms. He confirmed that the victim, Stephen Donaldson, had suffered a sustained and brutal attack. The press appeal called for witnesses who had seen his white BMW registration S73VED in the hours before his death. But behind the scenes, detectives began with the scene itself. Alongside Stephen's BMW, detectives also noted the presence of another vehicle, a blue car that was later identified only in reporting by the Daily Record and the Scottish Daily Express as belonging to Tasmin Glass. I tried to cross-match and verify this detail in other outlets, but nothing else carried this information apart from these 2 articles, so I have made it part of this video for this point only. Near the burnt-out BMW, forensic officers recovered fragments of a broken baseball bat. Testing revealed DNA that linked directly to Callum Davidson. It was the first solid lead connecting the killers to the reserve. Witness accounts added more detail. Several locals reported seeing 2 men on bicycles in Kirriemuir late that night. Acting on this, police seized Davidson's bike. Forensic testing uncovered Stephen Donaldson's blood on the handlebars, a physical proof that he had been involved in the attack. From there, the net began to close. Mobile phone data told its own story. Mobile phone data showed deleted messages, call records, and cell site connections, placing Davidson, Dickie and Glass at both Kirrie Hill and the Loch on the night of the killing. Digital evidence added another layer. Tasmin's Apple Watch showed her heart rate dropping into a resting pattern while the murder was being carried out. She had gone home and slept peacefully as Stephen was killed. Detectives also noted her bizarre calm when first approached. At her cafe job in Kirriemuir, she continued to make sandwiches and mix tuna rolls while quietly answering police questions about her boyfriend's death. Officers later said her lack of reaction was chilling. As the case unfolded, the brutality of the attack, carried out across 2 locations, left no doubt in their minds that this was deliberate and coordinated. With forensic science, digital trails, and community witnesses all pointing in the same direction, police moved quickly. Within days of Stephen Donaldson's body being discovered, 3 names were in custody: Tasmin Glass, Stephen Dickie, and Callum Davidson. All 3 were charged with murder. The Crown's case was that they had acted together, planning and carrying out what prosecutors later described as a concerted, murderous attack. The charges went further than just the killing itself. They included conspiracy, assault, and the destruction of evidence. When the trial papers were served, disturbing additional allegations came to light. Dickey and Davidson were also accused of animal cruelty in an earlier, unrelated incident. It was claimed they had put a kitten in a bag, swung it around, and punched and kicked it. Though separate from the murder, it painted a picture of the two men's capacity for cruelty, reinforcing the reputation for violence that locals already associated with them. Stephen Donaldson's murder sent shockwaves through Arbroath and Kirriemuir. These were close-knit towns, where the scale of violence felt almost unimaginable. For the family, the grief has been lifelong. In statements, they have often said their sentence is for life, a reminder that while those convicted may one day walk free, their pain will never end. This feeling was only sharpened by debates around Tasmin Glass's early release, which they opposed at every stage. We will talk about it in a few minutes. Each year since his death, an annual memorial motorbike ride has been held in Stephen's honour. Bikers from across Scotland gather to take part, their engines echoing through the Angus countryside as a moving tribute to one of their own. For those who ride, it is not only an act of remembrance, but also a symbol of solidarity with Stephen's family. Tributes have also been made in quieter ways. Flowers have been laid at the Peter Pan Play Park and at Loch of Carnordy, the two locations that marked Stephen's final hours. Friends have spoken about their determination to keep his memory alive. The trial opened at the High Court in Edinburgh in April 2019. It ran for 22 days with a jury of 15 men and women tasked with weighing the evidence. The Crown set out its case clearly. Tasmin Glass, they argued, had played a pivotal role. In support, they presented all the evidence that we have already discussed. The defence teams countered with competing narratives. For Glass, her counsel claimed there was no agreement for serious harm, only intimidation. They argued she had not known weapons would be used and that events had spiraled beyond her control. Davidson's lawyer turned attention to Dickey, painting him as a liar and a violent man who had taken the lead. Dickey's counsel responded in kind, saying Davidson was gratuitously violent and dishonest, accusing him of shifting blame to avoid responsibility. The evidence presented left little room for doubt. When the jury returned its verdicts, the outcome was decisive. Stephen Dickey and Callum Davidson were found guilty of murder. Tasmin Glass was convicted of culpable homicide, with the jury accepting. She had played a key role, but stopping short of finding her guilty of murder. The verdicts in May 2019 brought the case to its close inside the courtroom, with the combined sentences of 57 years. But the story did not end there. In many ways, what followed only deepened the sense of shock and anger that surrounded Stephen Donaldson's murder. All three of the accused lodged appeals in the months after their convictions, each attempting to have their sentences reduced. These were firmly rejected. The judges described Tasmin Glass as a prime mover in the killing, ruling that without her involvement, the attack could never have taken place. Their judgment echoed the prosecution's stance, that her role was not peripheral, but central. For the men, the outcomes were harsher still. Stephen Dickey and Callum Davidson had both been handed life sentences. Dickey, however, did not live long behind bars. He had been sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years, but in November 2019, just months after sentencing, he was found dead in his cell at HMP Perth. A subsequent fatal accident inquiry revealed that he had taken his own life after losing a prison job he valued. Reports also noted his use of psychoactive drugs in the lead-up to his death. For Stephen Donaldson's family, the news of his suicide brought no closure, only another grim footnote to an already devastating case. Tasmin Glass began her sentence at a young offenders institution. She was given 10 years for culpable homicide, a term that many observers, including Stephen's family, considered far too lenient given the scale of her involvement. Under Scottish sentencing rules, however, she became eligible for day release after serving just under 5 years, and parole after half of her sentence. By 2023, she was being considered for periods of day release from prison, a decision that angered Stephen's family, who described it as completely disrespectful to his memory. Then, in July 2024, she was granted parole after serving only half of her sentence. The decision provoked outrage both locally and nationally. For the Donaldson family, the release was described as a disaster, a sign that the justice system valued the rights of offenders over the lives of victims. Her presence in the community quickly became a source of controversy. She was moved to East Lothian under parole restrictions, but photographs soon surfaced showing her near a primary school in Dunbar. Local residents reacted with fury, calling for her removal and questioning why someone convicted of such a horrific crime had been released so soon. By April 2025, the Scottish Prison Service confirmed that her licence had been revoked and she had been returned to custody. Though details of the breach were not made public, her parole was formally cancelled. In August 2025, she was again considered for release, but the parole board rejected her bid. Davidson, however, remains in custody. He was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 24 years, meaning he will not be eligible for parole until well into the 2040s. What do you think about these cases and the sentences that were handed down? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you want more raw UK crime stories like this, subscribe to UK Crime Documentaries and hit the bell so you don't miss the next case.